Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, episode 370. I am your host, Nobilis Reed. This episode of Nobilis Erotica is sponsored by Circlet Press, the world's leading publisher of erotic science fiction and fantasy since 1992. Celebrate the erotic imagination with them at circlet.com. This week's story is Mirror by Clarice Clique. This lesbian story originally appeared in Like a Queen, edited by Cecilia Tan and Rachel Kincaid. Clarice Clique lives in the English countryside with her partner and children. She enjoys walking the dog and staring up at the big blue sky, dreaming of entirely different worlds. In her favorite world, she is a best-selling, completely happy nymphomaniac novelist. The narrator is my #1 fantastic spouse, Dee Reed. An author couldn't ask for a more supportive and understanding partner for this endeavor. Listen through to the end for a coupon code you can use on the Circlet Press website. Here we go.
Mirror by Clarice Clique. Read by Dee Reed. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? She stroked her finger over the gold frame as the surface shimmered into 1,000 colors that no normal human eye could see. It was a question she had asked every day for the last 100 years of her life. And always the answer was the same. But today was not like any other day in the last 100 years of her life. In a faraway kingdom that was too small to ever have... In a faraway kingdom that was too small to have ever attracted her attention, a young woman had had a ball to celebrate her 21st birthday. And at that ball, she had met a prince who, from the first moment he bent down to kiss her hand, had made her spirit soar and her body glow. So the mirror did not reply, "Thou, lady, art the fairest of all," and the woman waited, staring into the shimmering surface, wondering if, after all this time, her magic was beginning to fail her. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? She rested one finger at the top of the mirror and scratched her nails slowly down the surface. The noise reverberated through her castle. Something in her dungeon howled out in agony. "O Lady Witch, though fair ye be, Snow White is fairer far to see." She ripped the mirror off the wall and hurled it to the floor. But a moment before it hit the stone and shattered into 1,000,000 lost pieces, something made her click her fingers and freeze it in midair. She moved a finger and the mirror was back on the wall. "Show me this Snow White," she ordered. She stared at the scene, studying every detail. The girl was in bed, the top of a white linen sheet resting on the curve of her bosom. The sheet was not as white as the girl's skin, though. Next to her flesh, the expensive material looked old and shabby. The girl's hair was polished ebony spread out over the pillow and shining even in the night light. Her lips, redder than the most precious ruby, were parted as she breathed gently in a peaceful slumber. The witch watched the rise and fall of the girl's chest as if being hypnotized by the rhythmic movement. The witch untied the strings on her corset, letting her robes fall to the ground in disorder. "Mirror," she said, and the mirror transformed into an ordinary reflection. She looked at herself, tracing a nail over her hard strawberry nipples. She cupped her hands under her breasts and squeezed their fullness. Her body felt the same as it always did. She touched the soft curves of her stomach and hips, but she wasn't satisfied. Her alabaster skin did not look as white as it had yesterday. Her lips were not as scarlet, and her long black hair looked dull. "Snow White," she said. The mirror shimmered. The vision of her own body transformed into that of the young princess. She teased a finger between her legs as she gazed upon the image of the sleeping girl. The pleasure that others had to work so hard for, but was so easy for her, did not come. She licked her finger and pressed it against her magic spot. There was a tingle, but nothing more. She stared hard at the girl, a small crease furrowing her brow. Then her skin was smooth again. She clicked her fingers and was dressed in her traveling robes. "Mirror, "We are going on a journey," she said. She waited in the forest and wondered what she would do with the girl when she finally appeared. She had dealt with these types of damsels many times before, trapping them in towers, feeding them to wolves, sending them into eternal sleep, giving them as brides to beasts. She had felt her magic weaken the farther she had traveled from her castle, but she thought she still had enough strength to transform this girl into a swan. It had been a long time since she had done that, and it would suit this girl more than the last. She would be a perfect white swan. Then Snow White was there in the clearing, skipping like a girl. She was wearing a short dress, not the usual attire for a grown-up princess. The witch watched. There could be no harm in watching and waiting a moment before she cast the spell. As the girl skipped, her dress rode up, giving a flash of white thigh. She sang as she picked the fruit off the trees, and her voice was as sweet and natural as birdsong. When her basket was full, the girl turned and began to walk back to the palace. The witch walked alongside her behind the cover of the trees. She watched as the girl took an apple from the pile of fruit and bit into it, a drop of juice resting on her bottom lip. The witch stared at the single droplet glistening on Snow White's red lip until the girl escaped from her view and disappeared between the palace gates. If the witch had been in her own kingdom, she could have waved her hand, and the walls and guards and everything between her and the girl would have crumbled into dust. But she wasn't in her own kingdom. She would find another way. She pointed to a tree, and the mirror appeared on it. "Show me Snow White." The vision was of the girl running into a chamber and hugging an old man. The old man was laughing and took the basket of fruit with another big familial hug. The witch smiled. She had found her way. The king insisted on a grand wedding, and his bride-to-be smiled demurely and agreed with everything he said. In her thoughts, the witch ridiculed what this tiny, insignificant man considered grand. He talked more and more about the wedding night, telling her not to be scared and that he wouldn't hurt her. Once she had lost control and laughed in his face. She regained her composure enough to perform a memory obliteration and had ensured she did not slip up again. Her magic was drained in this kingdom. Ingredients were more difficult to find, and it took all her concentration to pretend she was a 22-year-old orphaned virgin princess. But she managed it. The wedding took place, and some carefully chosen herbs in the king's meals meant the wedding night would never take place. Men had never been a problem for her. When the king was in a sleep he would never stir from, the witch left her bedchamber and went to Snow White's. The king had never had the satisfaction of removing them, so the witch was still dressed in the modesty of her wedding clothes, her whole body covered by the most expensive and finely crafted white satin and lace. The train of her dress rustled against the floor, but there was no one to be disturbed by it. Snow White's chamber was but a few paces away from the king's. The witch did not hurry. She took small steps, standing upright and staring directly ahead of her. She looked exactly as she had hours earlier, walking up the aisle toward marriage with the king. The heavy wood of Snow White's door creaked when the witch pushed it open, but the girl did not start. The witch stood for a moment and let her eyes caress the reality of the image she had first seen in the mirror. The tender white skin, the full parted lips, everything still, apart from the gentle rise and fall of the girl's bosom. The witch's slippered feet made no sound as she moved to Snow White's side. A breeze stealing in the open window had blown a stray strand of hair over Snow White's forehead. The witch reached out a gloved hand and slowly stroked it back into place. This was the first time she touched the girl. She was used to hearing the minute movements of all around her, a rat scratching at a bag of flour in the cellar, the snore of a servant sleeping in the attic. It surprised her that all she could hear now was the beating of her own heart. Snow White's eyes opened wide. She looked up at her new stepmother, but she did not say a word. The witch stared down into the large blue eyes and was also silent. Since the witch's arrival, the girl had been skittering around the palace, avoiding her. She had shown great skill in managing never to speak to the witch or stay in her presence for longer than a few moments. Pleading illness and tiredness, she'd even escaped the ritual kissing of the new queen's hand at the wedding ceremony. But now they were alone together, and there was no king to concede to his daughter's every whim. The witch looked away from the girl and down at her own body, wondering what those bright blue eyes were seeing. She could, of course, pluck them out and know for certain, but she found she had no desire to break the silence of this night with the girl's agonizing screams. She held her hand out in front of Snow White's lips, feeling the warmth of the girl's breath through the thin lace of her gloves. "It is not proper for a queen's hand not to have been touched by the lips of the princess." The witch pronounced every syllable as if it was a rare delicacy in her mouth. Snow White gazed up at her. The girl's expression was so blank that the witch considered whether the girl's beauty had made her miss the fact that the princess was dumb. But then Snow White's ruby lips trembled slightly, and the girl raised her head the small distance needed to make her lips touch the witch's hand. They stared into each other's eyes, and neither of them moved. This simple touch had caused a spark of pleasure to shoot through the witch's nerves, making her feel alive and scaring her. It had been a long time since another had given her even a hint of the sensations that a light touch of her own fingers in her concealed place provided. She knew now was the time to deal with this girl before it became too late. She broke away from the girl's gaze and looked down at her clothes. She suffocated the pleasure she had just felt and made the anger blaze inside her, focusing on her power and her age and the humiliation of the game she'd played merely to get into this chit's bedchamber. "Once upon a time, in a palace far, far away, I was just like you," the witch said, "but then I discovered that white just wasn't my color." She yanked the right glove off and clicked her released fingers. The sound echoed around Snow White's room as if it was a living creature smashing against the walls. The witch's wedding clothes changed from pure white to violent red. She ripped at the neck of her gown, tearing the fabric away from her flesh. Snow White had not reacted to the transformation of color, but when the material fell away, revealing the full curves of the witch's breasts, she cried out and pulled the covers tightly around her own naked body. The witch smiled. She had not intended to destroy so much of the dress, but she pushed her shoulders back and her cleavage out. She was herself now, causing discomfort and fear in those around her. "I am not scared of you," Snow White said. The sound of the girl's voice made the witch pause. They did not normally sound like that, so calm. They normally pleaded for their lives in pathetic tones. They didn't speak with such confidence. And none of them had made her think of the scent of early morning and the taste of dew drunk from the petals of an angel flower. She closed her eyes for a moment before opening them again. "You will be, my dear, when you see what I am going to do to you." She clicked her fingers, and the mirror appeared on the wall. Snow White did not move. She did not appear to have noticed the mirror. The witch pulled the glove off her other hand, finger by finger, and let it drop to the floor. The breeze that had stirred Snow White's hair was building into a storm. She laughed in exhilaration. The power was rising from deep in her womb. She raised her arms above her head. "I am not scared of you," Snow White said. "I knew what you were the first time I saw you, waiting for me and spying on me in the forest." The witch's arms dropped to her side. She tilted her head to one side, and lines furrowed her brow. "You are different, but you are like the rest. You think I am a child and do not know. I tried to warn Papa, but he wouldn't listen to me. I knew you would be here one day. I've been waiting for you to come for me. I thought the prince would stop it happening, but he didn't come today to protect me from you. Papa told him that I was ill, and the illness was making me say things that were unsuitable for a young girl to say. Papa told him it was best for him to stay away until I was better. He listened to Papa's messages and not mine." "How did you see me? How did you know I would come? I don't sense the gift of future sight in you." The witch couldn't prevent herself from looking at Snow White. She gazed into those blue eyes, and Snow White stared back at her, but her eyes seemed to be looking at something else beyond the witch. "Before I was born, they tell me my mother pricked her finger on a needle. There was blood. Droplets of blood fell on Snow, and they say she saw snow against ebony. She thought it was beauty, and she wished that she would have a daughter with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. I was born to her, and then she died. Snow White swallowed hard. The witch glimpsed white teeth biting down on her red lip. Then the girl took a breath and continued. I know it wasn't meant to be. My mother wished for something she wasn't supposed to have, and she lost her life because of it. I try every day. I try so hard to be good, to earn the praise and acceptance of those around me. But I've always known what I really am. That's how I know what you are. We are the same. I'm not scared of you. I'm scared of myself. A single tear was falling down Snow White's cheek. The witch did something she'd never done before. She bent over the girl and kissed the tear, holding it on her lips and then swallowing it into her body. She felt the droplet of the girl's sadness as if it were 1,000 hailstones beating against her naked skin. The witch stood up straight. She looked sideways at herself in the mirror, and she didn't know whether the reflection showed an old hag or a young blossoming girl. Every witch that had been defeated by love. Love in all its many forms made people reckless, mad with courage. But more than that, love as a force silently untwined all the magics that witches need to weave to survive. It was the equivalent of dropping a shaving of unicorn horn into the most potent poison. All the power could be nullified. None would be left. The witch put her hand up to click her fingers together, but it wasn't the sound of magic that filled the room. It was the girl's voice. Please. The witch had heard that word many, many times in her life, but it had never before meant what it meant now. She looked over her shoulder. Snow White was sitting up in bed, her hands by her side, no longer holding the bed sheets around her body. The witch gazed at her. Snow White stared back for a long moment before her eyes dropped to the floor. The witch looked at the black hair, framing the beauty of Snow White's face, and the ends caressing Snow White's nipples. The witch looked at Snow White's nipples, perfect pink berries, inviting a tongue to lick their round contours while a hand held the firmness of the breasts they decorated. The witch looked at the slight curve of Snow White's belly and the enticing dip of her belly button. The witch looked at Snow White's legs. Snow White looked back up at the witch, her big blue eyes wide, her lips parted, and she opened her legs. The witch gave up. She fell on her knees before Snow White and buried her face in the moist pinkness. She breathed deeply, the scent of wild forests filling her nose. She hardly knew what she was doing. She didn't care what she was doing. She was all desire. She pushed her tongue deep between Snow White's lower lips, gasping as the girl's velvetness molded itself to her. The pleasure was so intense, the witch struggled to contain her magic. As her tongue darted in and out of the secret place, Snow White's body floated and sparkled. 1,000 tiny stars sprinkled over her. Snow White started to scream, and kept on screaming. The witch tasted the nectar falling on her tongue. The fire inside her was too strong. She pulled away from the girl and thrust her head out the window into the cool air. She willed the rain to fall from the sky, and it did, extinguishing the tiny flames that were igniting throughout her body. Her eyes were wild, and the moon and stars flashed in and out of the sky. She heard a voice calling her. Come back. Come back to me. Snow White was lying on the bed, one arm reaching out, fingers stretching toward her. She couldn't resist. Snow White helped the witch lay down on the bed and stroked her hair. She laid down beside her and pressed the witch's head into her bosom. The witch glanced into the mirror. She did not recognize herself. Snow White moved down the bed and brushed her own cheek against the witch's. May I kiss you? The witch nodded without speaking. Thank you, Snow White said. The witch closed her eyes and waited to feel the ruby lips against her own. Instead, she felt Snow White's hands tugging at her garments. The witch let herself be undressed, appreciating the cool air of the room on her revealed naked skin, making her breathe a little heavier and sending pangs of longing throughout her body. "You are beautiful," Snow White said when the witch was naked. The witch knew she was beautiful. She knew what every iota of her beauty cost in charms and potions and rigorous rituals and spells. But when Snow White said it, her spirit soared, and she floated a few inches above the bed. Snow White giggled. "Is it always this way when you are intimate with another? I felt like I was experiencing all the joy in the whole world when you touched me, and you had flames shooting out of your body." The witch smiled, a real, genuine, relaxed smile. "With a normal mortal, they do not usually physically combust." "Unless I want them to," she added mentally to herself. "But if it's the right person you choose to be intimate with, then it does feel like you are experiencing all the joy this world has to offer." The witch sat up and moved to stroke Snow White's cheek, but Snow White put her hands on the witch's shoulder and shook her head. "Let me kiss you now." The witch stared into Snow White's blue eyes as the princess's head lowered between the witch's spread thighs. Snow White's ruby lips disappeared, and all the witch knew was pleasure. The girl's tongue flicked over the witch's sensitive spot, and the witch screamed louder than Snow White had earlier. Snow White caressed the witch's thighs. She ran her tongue down the woman's legs to her toes and licked and suckled on them. The witch moaned and begged for Snow White's lips to touch every part of her body. Snow White traveled up the witch's flesh, her mouth dancing and teasing over the witch's open petals. Then she thrust 2 fingers hard into the other woman. Her fingers fucked the witch, showing no mercy as the witch writhed under her touch. Her mouth continued to move upwards, stopping at the witch's breasts to suck on her hard nipples. The witch felt like she was under the most powerful enchantment, that Snow White's body was controlling hers, forcing orgasm after orgasm to shoot through her, leaving her flesh shivering and defenseless. Snow White's movements became more tender. Her kisses were like being brushed by butterflies' wings. The girl let her long hair fall onto the witch's breasts and gently stroked them. Then Snow White smiled at the witch and wrapped her arms around her, drawing their bodies into a deep embrace. The witch looked into the mirror. The only difference she could see were the tears in her own eyes. She left Snow White's room many hours after dawn broke. Before she closed the door, Snow White called out to her, "Promise you'll look after Papa." It took the witch's most powerful magic to reverse the spell. She was drained and fell into a deep slumber, but her dreams were the happiest she had ever known. But when she awoke, Snow White's final words haunted her. While she was sleeping, Snow White had left the palace and gone to visit her favorite prince. It was not known when she would return. The kingdom buzzed with rumors of a forthcoming marriage. Had the turmoil of emotion she'd felt simply been the result of a simple seduction by Snow White to safeguard the life of her father? The witch met with a huntsman and made it clear she did not want to see Snow White again. Then she called him back and told him there was in fact a part of Snow White she did want to see again. She ordered him to bring the princess's bloody heart. The palace panicked, sending out search party after search party to find their missing princess. The queen sat on Snow White's empty bed holding a wooden box in both of her hands. But instead of opening it, she placed it on Snow White's pillow and walked over to the mirror hanging on the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, but she couldn't stop herself thinking of other images she had seen in its surface. This incident would vanish in the longevity of her life, an unnoticed rotten apple in an orchard of beautiful fruit. In the future, she would forget Snow White. Now she must focus on remembering herself. There were already fine lines at the corner of her mouth and eyes. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" It wasn't a question, but the mirror answered her anyways. "O Lady Queen, though fair ye be, Snow White is fairer far to see." The breath caught in the witch's throat. The mirror shimmered into an image of the princess surrounded by dwarves. She was singing to them. The witch slowly exhaled, then she clicked her fingers. She met the gaze of her reflection. The lines about her mouth and eyes had deepened. The witch looked in the window and saw the same sight she had seen for many moons past. She drew her cloak tighter around her. She was not used to feeling the cold. Every day in the cottage was the same. The dwarves went to work, pretending they were going to toil in the mines, when in truth they earned their precious gems and metals through trickery and thievery. Snow White kissed each one on the cheek before they walked out the door, and pretended she would spend the whole day tidying and baking, when in truth it took her only the time needed to click her fingers to transform the men's filth into cleanliness. One time she had experimented with the magic that the witch had unknowingly transferred to her in their moment of intimacy, and had enchanted animal, birds, and little elf folks to come in and do the chores. It had, of course, ended in disaster, but it had made the witch smile to see her try. The only other explanation Snow White made with her new powers was with her fingers delving between her velvet lips. Whenever the dwarves weren't there, Snow White was naked. She spent day after day playing with herself, sometimes lying down, sometimes standing up. When Snow White bathed herself in the chill waters of the lake, the witch watched the princess staring at her own reflection in the water as she teased her nipples and breathed out her orgasm. When the dwarves were there, Snow White was naked. She spent night after night playing with them, sometimes on her back, sometimes on her knees. Whichever dwarves were not eating or sleeping were pulling on Snow White's hair, hanging on her breasts, biting on her bullocks, and thrusting their prick into any of the princess's orifices which were available and that they could reach. Not all 7 of them were there, taking it in turns to fuck Snow White's mouth or shoot their cream over her. The witch winced every time a globule of the dwarf's white spunk landed in Snow White's ebony hair. It was a debasement of beauty, but Snow White was moaning as loudly as the dwarves, and the witch knew that if she herself allowed one of her hands to stray, it would find the moistness between her own thighs. She knew she had to end this, even though it was already too late. The witch had avoided seeing her reflection since leaving the palace, but she was confident that Snow White would not know her. She had been too long away from her own home, but it was more than that. It was her connection with the princess that had drained her. It would be impossible for a mortal body to display the true age of her soul, but whenever she glimpsed her own flesh, she saw a vessel clinging onto the last embers of life. After the dwarves left, whistling one of their crude songs as they journeyed off to find another victim to cheat and swindle, the witch knocked at the door. Snow White opened it with a smile. The look in those blue eyes was not one of surprise at getting a visitor when she was hidden so deep in the forest. It was the same look she had had when she had been in her own bedchamber and had looked up at the witch and parted her legs. Did she look at everyone like that? Is that why the huntsman had not killed her? Why the dwarves had given her shelter? Why the witch herself had failed in her own task? "Greetings, respected elder," Snow White said. "How may I help you on this fine morning? Would you be interested in the wares of an old, suffering woman?" The witch had not heard her own voice for a long while. It was aged, but would Snow White be able to recognize the tone which still belonged to the younger-looking woman who had covered the princess's body in gentle kisses? "I am sure I would like whatever you have to offer me," Snow White said. The witch was ashamed of the tremor in her hand as she removed the apple from the basket. She held it out for the girl to take. The fruit was as red as Snow White's lips. Snow White looked at the floor and then back into the witch's eyes. "I desire to taste that apple more than anything else, but I have no way to pay for such a royal fruit." "Seeing your beauty is payment enough." "I cannot refuse a gift." Snow White took the fruit from the witch, and her fingers lingered, touching the witch's skin. "I cannot refuse anything you give me." Snow White's lips parted, her tongue licked across her upper lip. She put the fruit to her mouth and bit into it. She chewed slowly, staring into the witch's eyes the whole time. Then she put the rest of the apple on the table and stepped toward the other woman. Her eyes were already glazed. Her body was swaying. She leaned into the witch, her breasts pressing against the witch's chest. Their noses brushed. Snow White tilted her head, and her lips were as close as lips can be without touching. The witch breathed in Snow White's warmth and felt she would never be cold again in her life. "Kiss me," Snow White whispered, and then she fell to the floor. The witch leaned over her and smoothed the girl's hair away from her face. She closed the lids of the blue eyes, and then she left, closing the door of the cottage quietly behind her. The witch had been dressed in her traveling robes through 12 full moons, but she did not leave. Every day she watched over the glass coffin the dwarves had placed Snow White in. Every night she stood beside it, staring down at the princess's ruby-red lips. Then one day, the witch heard the cantering hooves and shouts of a hunting party. She clicked her fingers, but the sounds did not fade away. One horse was coming closer. The witch knew who it would be before he appeared in the clearing and jumped off his mount beside the princess. There were forces that bent the world to their will that the most powerful witch could not control, and she was not even the most powerful witch anymore. Without a word, he broke the glass of the coffin and dragged Snow White's body out. He held her in his arms and pressed her lips down onto hers. And nothing happened. The witch laughed. It sounded like a cackle. "Who is there?" the prince shouted out, dropping Snow White onto the forest floor and pulling his sword out. The witch hobbled out of her hiding place. "Begone from this place, foul hag, before you receive the punishment all your kind deserve." The witch hardly heard his words. Fear had been holding her back. She had thought it had been the fear of dying, of giving the girl the last of her life essence. Now she knew it had been a greater fear than the fear of losing herself. The prince kicked her to the ground. She was barely aware of the blow. She crawled toward the princess. "Do not dare to touch her, you worthless creature, unless you wish to feel the blade of my sword hewing through your neck." The witch put her lips on Snow White's and kissed her. Both women clicked their fingers at the same time, and the prince's sword froze in the air. He strained to push it the remaining inch towards the witch's neck. Snow White offered her hand to the witch, and the witch stood up, brushing the dirt off her gown. Both women clicked their fingers again, and the prince's sword sliced into the ground, sinking deep into the earth. He struggled to pull it out. "Let go of it," the women said together, "and you will be released." The prince appeared not to hear them, his face turning purple with his efforts. "It is time to leave this place," Snow White said. "We've been here too long." The witch nodded. "It is time to go home." "This is home," the witch said. Her castle towered above them, but the witch was staring at the princess, waiting for a response. She wished she had taken the longer route and approached from the more picturesque east side. She was suddenly conscious of how much death there was surrounding them. Over the years, she had cast many spells that required her to leech the life out of the earth, and had never really cared or noticed until now. The witch considered whether she would be able to chase the girl if she ran back to the greenness and ease of her own palace again. Then Snow White smiled and stared into the witch's eyes. "This is home," Snow White said, pressing her hand against the witch's dress so the fabric formed a triangle at the top of the witch's thighs. Then Snow White laughed and spun away from the witch. She began tearing her clothes off. The witch danced after her, her eyes mesmerized as the princess revealed more and more of her flesh, until all her garments were discarded around the forest floor, and she stood naked a few feet in front of her. "Come here," the witch said, opening her arms out to receive the beauty of the girl's body. Snow White shook her head, her hair tumbling round her face as she laughed at the witch. "You have too many clothes on to interest me." The witch clicked her fingers and her clothes disappeared. She smiled as the power surged through her. After her period of weakness, when she had thought the magic would fade from her, she felt stronger than she ever had before. She was at her home, her source, and she had found someone to love. It amazed her that she, as a witch, had been able to harness the power of love after all. But she would think about that later. Right now, she needed to chase Snow White, who was running away from her, giggling into the trees. "Stop," the witch called. "You don't know the dangers that are hidden here." "Neither do you," Snow White said, appearing behind the witch and grabbing her around the waist. She bit down on the witch's neck and pinched her nipples before releasing her and disappearing again. "You do not realize how much danger you are in. Let me show you," the witch said. Then, in another voice, she spoke ancient words that twisted round her mouth and fought with her tongue not to be released into the world. The earth trembled, and trees that were older than the witch moved. Snow White was before her in a clearing. Branches and plants tangled around her limbs, pinning her spread eagle to the ground. The witch walked slowly over to the princess, and Snow White smiled up at her. "Show me how much danger I am in, then," she said. "What are you going to do? Kiss me and turn me into a frog?" The witch smiled down at Snow White. "I could do, but you would be of no use to me as a frog." She clicked her fingers, and a broken branch appeared in her hand. She licked her other finger and tapped it on the top of the branch, and the wood transformed into a wooden phallus. The witch was rewarded by seeing that for the first time since they had met, Snow White's eyes widened in something that might be a distant relative of fear. "I saw you enjoy yourselves with the dwarves, and I imagined your pleasure if you had something—" The witch paused and licked her tongue over her lips. "Bigger to play with." The witch rubbed the phallus over Snow White's cheeks and lips. Snow White's tongue darted out and licked the smooth end. The witch traced the outline of the princess's body, running the hard wood down her neck, over her breasts and stomach, caressing the softness of her thighs and the muscles of her calves before traveling back up to the delicate pinkness between Snow White's legs. She held it so it touched the girl's lower lips, and she waited, staring into the other woman's eyes. Snow White smiled at the witch. "Fuck me," she whispered in her sweetest voice. The witch plunged the wooden phallus into her, and Snow White yelled out, "Is it too much for you?" "Fuck me harder," Snow White replied. The witch responded by pulling the phallus out of her and then pushing back in with one swift motion. The princess screamed, but as the witch pulled it out, the princess raised her hips to keep it in her for longer. The witch used all her strength and magic to force the phallus in and out of Snow White, but the princess did not beg her to stop. She begged for more. The witch smiled. She left the phallus in Snow White, kissed one of her own fingers, and touched Snow White's most sensitive spot. The girl writhed and moaned and pulled against her bonds until finally she collapsed onto the ground. The witch rested her head on Snow White's heaving bosom and gazed up at the stars. "Are you going to release me now?" Snow White asked. "You know you can release yourself whenever you want," the witch replied, tracing her fingers over the princess's lips. The witch gazed into Snow White's eyes for a long moment. Then the princess clicked her fingers and wrapped her arms around the witch. The witch listened to the girl's heartbeat and realized she would never be the most powerful force in this world, and this thought made her happy. It was together that she and Snow White were strong. She was no longer alone. Many moons later, they lay on the bed, both of them staring into the mirror. Their naked bodies were entwined, and they were smiling. "I always knew we were the same," Snow White said. "I should never have tried to run away from my destiny." The witch squeezed her own and Snow White's nipples together with one hand. "And perhaps I should never have tried to kill you," the witch said. They both laughed at what had become their favorite joke. "But we have the most fun when you're trying to hurt me," Snow White said, and rolled on top of the witch, pinning her arms down. "We have the most fun when we're not talking," the witch said. She jerked out of Snow White's grip and pulled the princess's body against her own, tugging on the lower woman's nipples. She wrapped her arms and legs around Snow White and kissed her, pushing her tongue hard into her mouth before biting down on the ruby-red lips. And they lived happily ever after, although many other people didn't.
And there you have it. Did you like this story? Tell me what you think by calling the voicemail line at 571-297-3325. Send me an email or find me on Twitter. All those ways to contact me can be found on the podcast website at nobilis.libsyn.com. And here is your coupon code. Use Mirror Mirror to get Like a Queen for just 99 cents on the Circlet Press website at circlet.com. Before I go, I want to take just a moment to tell you about a podcast author friend of mine, Abigail Hilton. You may recall her as the author of Prophet of Panamandora and Cowrie Catchers that ran on audiobooks back in the day. She's still writing Panamandora stories. Her novel Scarlet Albatross has been out for something like a year now, and Jaeger Thunder is releasing in just a few days. Not only that, she's releasing a huge amount of content on her Patreon, where I am a proud supporter. So if you remember her, and you've lost track, go to abigailhilton.com to catch up. There are some fabulous stories there. And speaking of Patreon, if you're not supporting Nobilis Erotica, you're not getting the whole podcast. Sign up at patreon.com/nobilis to get monthly exclusive content in audio and ebook form. You have been listening to the Nobilis Erotica podcast. Theme music is composed and performed by Mass Relay. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Until next time, listen hard.